of a mass culture or popular cultural onslaught against traditional Western values. Now, this idea was given currency by people who claimed that somehow the Frankfurt School, despite its own culture, this with the maintenance of the system, been able to, in a curious and completely bizarre way, inspire a variety of popular cultural phenomena, most notoriously the Beatles. And in the work of the musicologist Theodor Adorno, supposedly the Beatles found the source of their transgressive music. This argument was made, of course, in Brazil as well by Olavo in his 2000, his critique, which began in 2002 of cultural Marxism. And he claimed before his death a couple of years ago that, or earlier this year, that the Frankfurt School and Adorno was somehow responsible for writing the songs of the Beatles. A claim which is so bizarre and outlandish, it would be as if someone argued that all of Pele's goals were actually scored by Franklin Delano Roosevelt from his wheelchair. In other words, it's so bizarre that it's hard to imagine anybody could take it seriously. But nonetheless, this idea of the Frankfurt School as the instigator of mass cultural destruction of traditional values was also used to explain everything from feminism and environmentalism to the acceptance of homosexuality, to the separation of church and state. You name any sort of progressive position, somehow the Frankfurt School was at the origin of this. Now, all of this would seem basically harmless, or at least annoying, but not without serious consequences, if not for the fact that we know that this has led specifically to violence. And the most a prominent example of this happened in 2011, when the Norwegian right-wing terrorist Anders Breivik murdered 8 people in Oslo with a bomb, and then went to the island of Otoyo and murdered another 69 children who were children in a socialist camp. And in a manifesto that he circulated just before his evil acts of terrorism, a manifesto, 1,500 pages, called 2083, he spent a great deal of time talking about the Frankfurt School, cultural Marxism, political correctness, and actually even cited my first book at great length. So we know that the cultural Marxism meme has consequences. And we know also that it spread in the United States through a variety of different figures who were on the fringes, people like Pat Buchanan or Andrew Breitbart or now Ben Shapiro. It's spread into the blood, we would say, of the Republican Party. And actually, we know that William Lind, at one point, we have a picture of it, gave a copy of a book he wrote to Donald Trump. We also know that a man named Rich Higgins, who was part of Trump's team, put together a memo in which he blamed the Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism for the ills of Western culture, and argued that Trump should mobilize against them. Now, in many ways, the most bizarre aspect of this is that this conspiracy theory has been refuted again and again and again. And an article I wrote back in 2011 was only one of many that now exists, casting incredible doubt on its origins, pointing out, for example, the fact that it recirculates traditional anti-Semitic tropes. There's a recent piece by Joan Brown going into great detail, showing how William Lind and Kevin MacDonald and others who have been perpetrators of the Frankfurt School meme have been very much involved with traditional anti-Semitic campaigns. It's also, in a way, been, and this is perhaps most frustrating to me in particular, it's also been disseminated without in any way engaging in a dialogue with those of us who in Brazil and the United States have taken critical theory seriously in the way that I argued a moment ago in terms of a traveling theory that needs to be contested, needs to be argued about, needs to be expanded, but need not be accepted dogmatically. Instead, there's absolutely no, we might say, interchange between the two levels of the real theoretical response to critical theory and this pseudo conspiratorial level. Instead, the latter simply goes on, abetted by the internet, embedded by the possibility of YouTube to have video after video in Portuguese and English and many different languages around the world about critical theory. So the question seems to me, what can we do about this? And it's very difficult to simply argue against it, to show that it's historically untenable, to make a case basically the people who are talking about it don't know what they're talking about. That doesn't seem to suffice. Instead, we have to understand its deeper roots and the function that it still serves, and alas, seems to be serving even more frequently, both in Brazil and the United States. The first thing to note is that the notion of the Frankfurt School as a Marxist phenomenon is very crucial to the theory. Cultural Marxism is the major, we might say, bridge between the actual Frankfurt School and the critique of political correctness. And here, the Marxism involved is, in a way, a code word for a kind of, we might say, original sin, a kind of demonic initial evil that can't, in a way, be eradicated. There is, in American race theory, or pseudo-race theory, what is sometimes called the one-drop rule, which was instigated during the Jim Crow era in the late 19th, early 20th century, to argue that merely one drop of black blood created a racial identity that was as black as 100% African heritage. The one-drop rule has in a way been modified in Brazil, I know, through various other racial categories, but in the United States, one drop was enough. Now, this was utterly irrational, and the irrationality of it is best shown by the fact that a white mother was able to have a black child, but a black mother was not allowed, through this theory, ever to have a white child, a kind of crazy, irrational asymmetry. Now, I mention this because there's something analogous when it comes to Marxism. The Frankfurt School was indeed originally Marxist. The Frankfurt School was a heterodox Western Marxist formation. But as we know, it combined its Marxism with many other theories, psychoanalysis among them. And by the time it got to the second generation, Jürgen Habermas, the Marxist pedigree, we might say, was diluted to the point where it was attacked by more traditional Marxists as essentially an apostasy, as a heterodox theory which had lost any ground in political economy, which was no longer in any serious sense Marxist. The conspiracy theory, on the other hand, argues in this tradition of drop, that one drop of original Marxism, no matter how it might have been combined, diluted, interpreted, is enough to taint everything that descends from it. So by tying critical theory to critical legal studies, to critical race theory, to anything that involves progressive ideas on issues of education or sexuality or race, the original sin of Marxism is somehow continued. With the idea that all of these progressive ideas are some, in a very deep sense, some ways still Marxist, and that Willy Münzenberg and the Comintern are still somehow behind the source of the current positions which these critics dislike. So that's one aspect of it, a kind of phantasmatic one-drop theory, that Marxism can pollute everything that it touches rather than being seen historically as one moment in an ongoing theoretical development, which in many ways has elaborated, moved beyond, and in some cases even repudiated its Marxist origins. So that's one major thing to keep in mind. A second aspect of the power of the theory is its weird, we might say, functioning of certain leftist criticisms. That it's on the radical right, but like Lyndon LaRouche himself, it's mobile. It moves from the left to the right, back and forth from one fringe to the other. And this was shown initially to me when the Frankfurt School attention not to by the alt-right, but, and this is extremely hard to really absorb, but by no less a figure on the left than Fidel Castro. In 2010, Castro was influenced by a conspiracy theorist named Estulin, who wrote a book on the so-called Bilderberg conspiracy. No reason to go into the details. They're all basically nonsensical. But Castro invited him down, Estulin down to Havana. And they met, and Castro embraced the idea that the Frankfurt School had been involved in counter-revolutionary activities. And reversing what I said earlier about Olavo's use of music, he argued that the Frankfurt School had, in fact, also contributed to popular music, but not to subvert Western culture, but rather to subvert the revolution. So this kind of weird symmetry or kind of, I don't know what, false symmetry between a left and a right-wing version of critical theory as having done something using mass culture in ways that were diametrically opposed shows that there is something in the right-wing meme that also mirrors certain conspiratorial, let's say, tendencies on the left. The most obvious of these is a shared attack on globalization. And this, of course, is an extraordinarily complex subject. It involves a serious discussion of neoliberalism. It involves a serious discussion of various international organizations like the IMF. It would involve a serious discussion of the ways in which universalist theory and universalist practices, including what we might call the globalization of capitalism, have created real, let's say, issues and tensions in the world, which could be exploited for left or right-wing purposes. So the left-wing critique of globalization led to a certain populist response, a certain belief that there were indeed elites that were manipulating various post or, let's say, international mechanisms to increase profits, to increase their control, often behind the scenes. And there is, we have to admit, a modicum of plausibility and maybe even truth to this analysis. We all feel, I think, if those of us are on the left, a certain amount of unease with neoliberal globalization and the way in which, a variety of aspects of neoliberal globalization created increased inequality and created a kind of authoritarian response. And the right-wing critique of political correctness and cultural Marxism also, in a way, adopts a similar attack on globalization, a similar attack on an international conspiracy, which is at the root of a variety of different ills, not the ills that the left accepts, but ills that are nonetheless, from a right-wing point of view, just as nefarious. So, as the French used to say, les extrêmes se touchent. The extreme left and right-wing poles can come together. And the Frankfurt School weirdly can be accused, and anti-Semitism, as we know, is often used by the left as well as the right, can be accused of fostering a kind of corrosive position, which behind the scenes explains a lot of things which have to be explained or should be explained in much more serious, substantive, structural ways. In both cases, and this is why conspiracy theories are so problematic, in both cases, there is a short circuiting of a real explanation. There is a kind of scapegoating mechanism, a kind of attempt to explain complex things by simple origins, a claim to accept structural things by agency, which attributes too much power to agents who may in fact plot but don't really produce outcomes. And both the left and the right-wing adoption of a conspiracy theory can lead to, we might say, a short-circuiting of the real difficult work that needs to be done to explain on a structural level the sources of some of the ills that befall us. So I'm not sure really, one of the things that's been most frustrating in the past 10 or 12 years when I've been involved in this, I'm not sure how we can really answer this threat. It's a threat that involves not simply a reasoned response, not simply providing a good historical account of the actual history of critical theory. It's much more diverse and much more internally contested tradition. But we have to somehow be able to really look at the, we might say, pain that the adoption of the meme, the adoption on the part of the right, the real, let's say, distress that it is a pseudo answer to, a distress which is produced by perhaps globalization, by greater inequality, by the, alas, failure of traditional institutions to deal with the real problems that beset us. So, perhaps it's time for me to stop and to open up the discussion. There's a lot more that obviously can be said about how the theory has developed, and this is the point made about traveling theory in your context, and how it's developed in my context, and how it's developed elsewhere around the world. In Brazil, it seems to me it's had a greater immediate impact, and there are figures like Eduardo Bolsonaro, Abraham Weintraub, and others, the foreign minister who was recently outed, Ernesto Ojao, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, also adopted it. In other words, there has been a much greater use of the theory than perhaps at the highest levels of the American government, but it exists in both of our contexts. And I'm very anxious to hear what my Brazilian colleagues have to say about how it has been spread in Brazil, what the response should be to it, and how we can deal with the traveling theory, a traveling conspiracy theory, that we ought not to allow to travel any further. So thanks very much for your attention, and thanks to the interpreters for rendering my thoughts into Portuguese, and I look forward to what follows.
Thank you, Professor Martin J. Now we will pass the floor to Felipe Catalani. Please, Felipe.
Alô, vocês me ouvem?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Liv and Leonardo, for inviting me and organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here with Professor Rosane as well, and of course with Professor Martin J., who is a reference for all of us here in Brazil who study critical theory. Your book is still an extremely current book, not only related to there has a lot of books for this a sort of a bio. I will comment that was big, the splinters in your eye. Jay's text about the Frankfurt School as a right-wing scapegoat. I remember that this meme was also present here in Brazil during the 2018 elections. And at the time, I followed Olavo de Carvalho, who fortunately is no longer among us on social media. And I remember that one day he wrote that Haddad, our leftist candidate, in his book In Defense of Socialism, advocated for something similar to a society predicted by Marcuse and the total suspension of taboos. Something like that. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something like this. And of course, the quote did not exist in Haddad's book, but the rumor about the dangers of Freudal Marxism circulated a lot and was always accompanied by strong sexual paranoia. Everyone remembers the accusations of pedophilia, the gay kit, and other memes. And Bolsonaro himself even publicized the candidate's Haddad's CV, pointing out that he had been mentored by the Marxists from USP. And I did some research and I saw that in 2018, during the elections, there was an article that was published in Gazeta do Povo, a newspaper here, and it was republished by a website called from Mises Brazil, ultra liberal website, and it was entitled Fernando Haddad, a self-declared Marxist, of the Frankfurt School. By this time, of course, the ideological junk of the American alt-right was already widely contaminating Brazil, especially through Olavo de Carvalho. And by the way, this is a question for us. What is the specificity, if there is one, of the Brazilian alt-right, or to what extent does it reproduce ideological patterns of the new right, the global new right, which are repeated in many different countries? This shows perhaps how those anti-globalists are actually pretty globalized internationally. Well, of course, for us who were studying Frankfurt's critical theory at the time, when we saw those things, at first sight, it was funny or even flattering. Imagine being considered a threat to the Western civilization. On top of that, Brazil at that moment had become a caricature of dialectic of enlightenment. On one side, Haddad, who claimed to be himself an agent of civilization against barbarism. On the other, Bolsonaro, precisely called the myth. Well, it was all set up there. The progressive modernizing cycle of democratic reconstruction from 1994 to 2016 had produced, from its internal contradictions, its own relapse into barbarism, its own inversion of the Enlightenment into the myth. As Frankfurtians would say, Umschlag, but in Brazil. However, the hegemonic leftist reading saw things differently, as it is inherent to the dualism that traditionally marks our national self-understanding. We saw a great regression there. There was a book that was published in Europe and the United States that had this title, but in Brazil, what did that mean? That would be a reaction to the heavy structures of backwardness that did not allow themselves to be transformed by the forces of progress. We begin speaking, for example, of an elite of backwardness, of the permanence of a colonial and supposedly pre-modern structures. It is instead of trying to understand how the contradictions of capitalist development of the last 30, 40 years with its crisis dynamic were expressed in Brazil, it seemed more convenient to identify a kind of moral backwardness, a patriarchal mentality that was not overcome by the forces of progress. Almost as if fascism were a moral or psychological problem and not something that has its basis in the objective social tendencies. Let's remember, and we have been remembered of that, Adorno himself, who relied so much on Freud, always repeated that fascism had no psychological causes.
And of course, that has to do with how we understand the so-called lunatic fringe, as they say in the United States. After all, there is a very consoling, even conformist side to say, oh, these lunatics, these beasts, or these as an exceptional behavior. Or also, as it said, Hillary Clinton, this basket of deplorables. Well, this kind of argument was also recurrent in Europe in the 1940s, and that was precisely what Frankfurtians were turning against. According to the liberal interpretation at the time, fascism was a peculiarity of a backward country, a German and Italian aberration, something that was impossible to emerge in advanced countries such as England, France, and the United States, countries with consolidated democratic institutions and a modern and developed capitalist economy, not so much in France. So German irrationality would be a kind of remnant of the romantic resistance to modern life. And quite a few have fallen into the trap of irrationalism. So even someone as intellectual as Franz Neumann, who circulated in the Frankfurt environment, albeit with some friction, had the hope that German engineers and scientists would be the main break in Hitler's rise. After all, it is their job to be on the side of reason, science, democracy, progress, etc., which would, at first, be irreconcilable with the mythical world of Nazi fascism. What happened was the opposite. Many of these engineers became true ideologues of the Deutsch technique, the German technique. This was a different industry that these engineers had in Germany. That is, in fact, Nazi fascism had an anti-modern side, and at the same time, it was hyper-modern. It was the very definition of bourgeois revolution in Germany. And so basically, Frankfurt's critical theory arises from the attempt to understand this dialect, this apparently inexplicable phenomenon of things turning into their opposites. And of course, this undermined the environment in post-war Germany, which was now under US dominance. But now back to Professor J's argument. The phenomenon analyzed by him is something quite curious, as there is an inversion of relations. It's not the critical theorist analyzing the far right, but the far right analyzing the critical theory. And what Jay does is, in turn, to fight back and analyze this analysis. As we have seen, as its heart, the far right's Frankfurt School's interpretation is a paranoid comprehension, a conspiracy theory. But the conspiracy theory also has a ballast. I mean, Jameson realized this when he said that a conspiracy theory is an intuition. They're apparently dispersed and disconnected, are actually linked to each other. This is very clear in the case of anti-Semitism. In fact, almost every conspiracy theory ends up having an vice versa. Anti-Semitism, the framework of all conspiracy theories. Moshe Postone, who deceased a few years ago, has a brilliant article in which he says that anti-Semitism is a revolution against the abstract side of the commodity, which in turn fetishizes its concrete material side, which means there is this revolution moment. So, in short, a conspiracy theory is in general as a critique of the world, as to understand in an incomprehensible world. It certainly carries an interpretative theory. This term, interpretative theory, is used by Gunther Anders in his essay on Kafka, in which he analyzes these impotent individuals in the face of a monstrous apparatus. In other words, a conspiracy theory is a symptom of alienation and at the same time a rebellion against the same alienation. However, it's a pathological rebellion, hence its relationship with fascism, which is not simply conservatism. Fascism is not the definition here between us, which is a definition given by a Portuguese historian, João Bernardo. He says, a rebellion in order. So I would also like to pose this question, which has already been mentioned by Professor Jay, this idea of this politically transverse phenomenon, these conspiracies that come from left to right and vice versa. And how we can see this in some fixations in geopolitical analysis, in which the social complexity of the capital, of the money, is reduced on the actions of big actors in politics or imperialism. And one of the anecdotes, paranoias of this Frankfurt school, I would like to add one, which is a book of Domenico Losurdo, Western Marxism. It's very impressive. He says that Adorno's criticism to the people spirit in the negative dialect, it's actually a takeover of Adorno in favor of France in Argelia War. So the Frankfurtians are actually disguised imperialists. And in 1968, people would already say that Marcuse would be a CIA agent. So I would like to bring this to our discussion as how this geopolitical element in the conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theories, they have the geopolitics, they brings some ideas of this feeling of understanding the social totality. You, professor, you have this book of social totality, and you navigate through this concept. So it would be interesting to talk about this totality, the relationship between geopolitics, conspiracy theory, and these other terms.
Thank you very much, Felipe Catalani. Thank you very much. I would just like to remind the people who are watching us through YouTube, your comments reactions, questions are welcomed here on the chat, and we will bring them to the debaters as well as Martin J at the end of their speech. Professor Rosane Borges, would you like to have the floor? Okay, good afternoon. I would like to thank Professor Liv for the invitation to be here on this afternoon on the Knowledge Festival, the Federal University of Rio, which has been a big event, both nationally and internationally, giving meaning to the role of the university. And I am even happier to talk about a topic that is so dear to me and that I am a big part of, especially after the rise of Bolsonaro related to racism, patriarchy in Brazil. And it's especially having to do dialogue with Professor who I read and who is a reference to me, Professor J. So it is a very important and fundamental opportunity to exchange ideas and dialogue about those questions that have been in our minds, especially since the 20th century. Professor, you brought a lot of issues that I consider to be fundamental for us to try to create bonds and collections of reflections of those impulses that the conspiracy theories have been getting over the last few years, and especially in the 21st century, because now it does wear a different pair of boots, a different coat, but the fundaments are ultimately the same. Us who study Frankfurt School in communication areas, and we study how it has become a target, as the professor said, through the right wing perspective or left wing perspective. It brought a lot of critique through to critical theory. And I thought about the accusations to Adorno that talked about the Abyss Hotel. And Adorno said that he would never think, he never thought that they would try to make his theory into a Molotov cocktail. So I think this is an idea that we could take into consideration, thinking about the accusation and Adorno's response to it. I would dare to say, and you are a specialist, I would dare to say that the critical theory and Frankfurt School, it's a flagrant of modern society that has failed. We got into the 20th century and Freud called us little human beings, and all of the beliefs in science, technical revolution, and we saw this modern society giving us barbarism, warfare, and there are a lot of studies that talk about the philosophical side of it, but also sees how technological growth of communication happened. So that really bothered our Western society. So that society that saw how capitalism was effective in the technical capacity, and an, an author who wrote about the communication performance and press and talked about capital of profit And in the 21st century, we see a lot of those fundamentals that were based to a lot of the critics, and how Frankfurt School was monopolized by the new right, the new global right. I am going to read a very small part of a paper. I didn't send it. They asked me to send it, but I didn't. But I will only read a fraction of that text. And I wrote it after Bolsonaro's elections. And it starts with a question that was how was possible. And I say the elements collected from the floor of the world we live in are walking right in front of us. We have felt for a while the symptoms of an illness that spread waves of obscure, indefinite comforts. From those, angry voices came about, and they became protagonists of the public world. WhatsApp, Telegram showed us how violent this process that has gotten to Brazil pressed the button of violence that has been among us forever. Polarization, hate became usual expressions to talk about the country and its citizens. A country that used to be seen as warming, welcoming, and joking. We saw that the illness came especially from the end of class conciliation that was provoked by the elites that decided to stop coming to the playground. We saw from another side that the left wing failed looking at the excluded society because they stopped seeing what they wanted and desired. We also see that the popular protests in 2013 aspired for new ways of in the politics. And that's a lot of people to the far right had a lot of strength, and we felt it in the elections of 2018. Since Carlos Lacerda, this spectrum experienced a very successful performance. Even though were there were evidence, considered it impossible for a far right to actually make it to the presidency in Brazil. It believed that it might get to other powers and to the Congress. In different groups of the Congress. So some believed that it would only stay on the streets. Other people said that it would be better to resist the opposition that wasn't really strength enough to fight him. Bolsonaro say his dream competition would be the competition of a Labor Party after Lula was no longer an eligible candidate because his victory was certain, but it would.
Since 2014, Bolsonaro said he would promise the best to all different levels of the Brazilian society, of the good people, people from the church, and they have announced this crusade for the traditional Brazilian family and fighting against promiscuity and sexuality and the left or people who are gay and lesbians and the population trans. He promised the glory back because people who have lost their monies and their possessions to people who they have lost their wealth to Black people or people for the lower classes. And he said he would embrace these other classes and give them back what they deserved. They give privileges conceded to minorities. Bolsonaro and the economist, the Minister of Economy, Paulo Guedes, they have promised a neoliberal agenda that would bring social justice. Part of the business people of the productive sector, this is another layer that has also seen this change project that would bring the possibility of not having to comply with labor laws. The good people who would defend family and property. They would foster the capitalism and the elite of corporations. They have seen each other with connected through these threads. They saw on the anti-petismo, which is a movement, a right movement in Brazil, as a meaning of hope. I would like to now stop reading, and I would like to think is it possible? I mean, we usually say that there has only been one Nazism, but many fascisms in the plural. And now what we see of the nation states is how these conspiracy theories, they drink of the fascisms and they get their own formats, their own shapes. We have here in Brazil, because we have always been dived into a past that doesn't go away. We are a very extremely racist and patriarchal and sexist country. And it's through these institutions that Bolsonaro could build this platform of destroying who is the other and renewing this idea in which these conspiracy theory, they gained space, a wider space. And I would like to pose this question, Professor, in this way. And now coming back to the communication field, because they also got this enhanced, because the losers of the world and the losers in Brazil who felt that they had no justice with the benefits of the government, these affirmative actions. They got very angry with the president Dilma, for example. And they now felt that they would be able to communicate now and to have their voices heard. This is a fundamental phenomenon in order so that Mr. Bolsonaro could come and ascend to power. We don't need, they say that we don't need specialists, experts, and we are going to solve everything by ourselves. And there was this discourse And the social medias, they also make this easier, much easier, in which that information and knowledge started to be considered as something of the past that don't matter anymore. And what is predominant now were the beliefs of groups that started to feel loss in a lost situation. And if the loss since 2018 was a loss that actually affected a part of the planet with the crisis in the world, we can't always evaluate these losses, and we have to try to as if we needed to blame on an enemy, blame all these crises on an enemy. So in Brazil, we have the racism with the presence of Black students in the universities, which is a benefit from Dilma's government, as this has made an enemy and bringing back sexism and racism as fundamental categories. And I would like to ask how we could think about these phenomenons in a ways that they all join together in a common platform. It's a reaction of trying to destroy the enemy and attach this to this enemy, these theories that are threats that are threatening our families. The trans people, they are threatening our family. They are a stain, biologically speaking. Black people don't need space in the university. And how can we think in a local dimension? I can say that our extreme right is very connected to these points, these matters, to racial and gender issues. No wonder that our president's speech is very contaminated by the speech issue. But also, how can we, this gender issue, and how can we connect this to our discussions? How can we think systematically? No wonder that conspiracy theories, they prosper in crises, in cosmopolitan societies, in this this so-called expansion of rights. And how could we think in these issues related to Brazil? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rosane Borges. Now, with these questions of them, I would like to call Mr. Professor Martin J. Once again, we would like to know how we would respond to these questions that have been raised.
First, let me thank Felipe and Rosane for extremely rich and provocative responses. I mean, I really don't have the time to do justice to the issues they raised, but let me make two major points. The first has to do with the issue of pathologization and psychological, we might even call it demonization of our opponents. And this is a very, I think, difficult issue to deal with. It's a paradoxical issue. The Frankfurt School, as we know, often adopted psychoanalytic terminology to explain baffling behavior on the part of workers who were not revolutionary, on the part of lower middle class people who were lured to the right, even to fascism. They use the idea of the authoritarian personality to argue that there was a psychological rather than rational dimension to political behavior. And it's very difficult for us, I think, to deny the power of this kind of approach. When we hear someone like Olavo saying that the Beatles were basically written by Adorno, the music of the Beatles by Adorno, we hear something that is so insane, so crazy, so impossible, that the only way we can explain it is through a kind of paranoid explanation. Having said that, there is, however, a danger in pathologizing our opponents, because what it does is to rob them of their dignity. It's a means to say that they are beneath the capacity to argue, to reason, to be persuaded. They are, in a way, the prisoner of their own psyches, of their own characters, of their own neuroses, of their own demons. And what it does is make it impossible to have any sort of constructive dialogue. Now, maybe you can't have a dialogue with the Anders Breiviks of the world, but they really are expressions of a kind of radical evil. But it's necessary, it seems to me, to try to be, if not compassionate, at least open-minded when it comes to the pain of those people who adopt what we see as irrational positions. And it's clear that there was something happening in the global populist response to global elitism that was a genuine expression of victimhood. We ourselves understand victimhood very well, victimhood of people who are racial minorities, people who are sexual deviants, people who are lower class. We know that kind of victimhood. But there's also the victimhood of people who feel threatened by change, who feel threatened by the loss of status, who feel threatened by their identity being questioned, who feel threatened by the very pathologization of their position. So this creates what I would call an extremely difficult challenge, which is the challenge to treat these people not as if they were a priori pathological, but to treat them as potentially rational and to try somehow to bring them back to the point where we accept their grievances as real, their pain is real, and yet try to somehow tell them, illuminate their dilemmas in a way that they will be open to persuasion. Now, whether or not many of them will, I can't say, but I think that's part of the challenge of a politics which does not demonize and pathologize the enemy in a way that duplicates what the enemy does to us. I mean, there's a real dialectic here that has to be taken into account. Now, one of the points that Rosane made had to do with the issue of the crisis of Western culture, the crisis of modernity. These are all, of course, immense issues. One of the real, I think, dilemmas is how we treat something called Western culture or modern Western culture. The right wing, for some decades now, has adopted the role of the defender of the West against what it sees as the global South or the enemy within or immigrants or infiltration, whatever the kind of fantasy of the challenge to Western civilization. Now, what made the Frankfurt School so interesting initially was its dialectical approach to Western civilization, its dialectic of enlightenment, not simply thumbs up or thumbs down, not simply a defense or an attack, but a recognition that Western culture, broadly speaking, Judeo-Christian, let's include even Islamic culture as part of that, culture which was so diverse and changed over millennia of its development, that it had resources that could be used to combat its own worst impulses. That, in other words, it was necessary to do not an external critique of Western culture, as if Western culture was simply evil and had to be replaced by something else, or a simple-minded defense of Western culture to core, as if it were inherently good and without its own contradictions, but rather do an immanent critique of it, to argue that, yes, it has values that it doesn't live up to. Yes, it has ideologies which it pretends to uphold and then in practice is unable to maintain, in fact, maybe cynically subverts. But that without the resources that the broad history of Western culture has given us, and I want to have the most capacious version of Western culture. It includes colonial societies, which are societies that are not simply Western, but have inputs from other non-Western backgrounds. without drawing on those resources, we're in trouble. So the real question is to avoid an either or, to avoid a simple-minded defense or an external attack, but rather to feel somehow that we have to salvage aspects of the dialectic of both Enlightenment and Western culture, which can help us to move in a, let's call it, progressive or enlightened direction, and be self-critical enough to recognize that we have failed in many respects, that we need to recognize and call out those failures without somehow succumbing to an either-or rhetoric. So I'm not sure that answers all of the issues that both of our extremely provocative respondents raised, but I hope that will move the conversation a bit forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Would either of the debaters like to comment on Professor Jay's answer, or should we go to the questions raised in the chat? There are just a couple. Would either Felipe or Rosane, vocês gostariam de responder agora ou deixar para depois?
Deixa o pessoal, o público perguntar e aí a gente pode...
Okay.
We can have the public ask questions and maybe we can say something later. Okay, so going back to Portuguese, I would like to read Maria Jupaiva's question. And he says, Martin J., very nice speech. Please, I would like to know your evaluation about what would be the theoretical axis that sustains the conspiracy theory.
Isso é uma segunda.
That is one of the questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Should I answer it first? Yeah. All right. So if I understood the question correctly, what is the theoretical explanation of conspiracy theories themselves? Or
what is the sort of theoretical basis that sustains conspiracy theories?
Right. Well, I think I actually a few years ago wrote a piece trying to answer this question. I don't know how successfully. I mean, it seems to me that there is a continuum between conspiracy theories and a certain kind of what we might call legitimate explanatory attempt to make sense of a complex world. What conspiracy theories do is to emphasize agency, to emphasize the power of a small group of people, often hiding behind the curtain, to influence the changes that we see around us. That, in other words, it gives credence to the idea that people have power, that people can affect a change through conspiring, which means breathing together. In other words, collaborative activity. That it's possible for people to get together and actually do something to make a difference. Now, they obviously grant too much power to people, and they usually see it as sinister power. But first of all, we know that there really are conspiracies. The conspiracies do exist, sometimes for good effects, sometimes for bad effects. I mean, there was a conspiracy in the German army to kill Adolf Hitler in 1944. It failed, alas, but its intentions were good. So conspiracies do exist. Now, what conspiracy theories overemphasize, of course, is precisely the power of agents to change structures, the power of agents to change systems. And they underplay the importance of the systemic constraints, what we might call the automatic working out of, if we're Marxists, we call them contradictions, or at least, let's say, the tensions that exist in a world which are not produced by intentionality, the unintended consequences of actions, the unintended consequences of even public rather than just simply private conspiring, that we want to be able to make a difference, but often our intentions are thwarted. Now, there is a place in dialectic enlightenment where Adorno and Horkheimer actually say that paranoia has a role in genuine knowledge, because what it involves is a certain projection onto the world of a pattern, a certain ability to see what Henry James famously called a figure in the carpet, In other words, the metaphor of a complex, say, oriental carpet, and one finds a pattern within it. One finds a formal pattern, a figure in the carpet. And that paranoia is a necessary, we might say, element in all types of interpretive activity, because we're faced with a great deal of what we might call chaos, contingency, confusion. And we seek order, we seek meaning, we seek something that gives us orientation. Conspiracy theories short circuit the, we might call it hard work that you need to find those patterns, and they impose too much rather than simply are passively waiting, or at least expectantly waiting to find the order that's actually there. But they're on a spectrum with the rest of us who also need in some ways to project order, project meaning, project formal structure onto a chaos of things that happen in ways that we can't explain. You may know the work of Hayden White, the American philosopher of history, who argued that whenever we narrate history, we depend on a finite number of rhetorical tropes. We narrate history as a comedy or as a tragedy. We narrate history as a romance, or we narrate it ironically. We narrate it satirically. There are a variety of these kinds of what we might call pre-formed, a priori, tropic impositions. And all of these are, in a sense, untrue to the messiness of history. They're a kind of post facto imposition. And yet they are necessary. All our narrations depend on certain tropic conventions. So like a paranoid projection, which the conspiracy theorists are doing a little bit too much and unselfconsciously, even what we might call non-pathological normal explanation does involve a certain, we might say, modicum, a certain moment of this kind of paranoid projection. So what I would argue is that there is a continuum, there's a spectrum in which conspiracies and normal non-pathological explanatory reasoning, a spectrum in which both of them can be found. And the fact that there have been real conspiracies in the world, and still are, makes it plausible for conspiracy theorists to continue their attempt to seek occluded secrets which are not part of public knowledge. And every so often, they do, in fact, find the real conspiracy. Now, alas, they tend to find many that don't exist, and they connect dots that are not even there. And so no matter what Olavo thought, there's no way in which Teodorno wrote the lyrics to Strawberry Fields Forever.
Muito obrigada por isso. Muito interessante.
Thank you very much, Professor. This positive aspect of paranoia is very interesting. I have always suspected. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to read Leonardo Santos' question, who was here. Some specialists have defined the far-right political project anchored by the attacks to cultural Marxism in Brazil and the US through the definition of populism. Digital populism or authoritarian populism. Other specialists prefer using neo-fascism or post-fascism concepts. After classifying Donald Trump as a plutocrat in 2017, the historian Robert Paxton went on to define him as fascist after the invasion of the Capitol in January 2020. How do you define the characteristic of the political project disseminated through the attacks on cultural Marxism in the context of these debates?
This is, of course, a very vexed question in the United States as well. In other words, the terminology that we use to try to make sense of a phenomenon that we did not expect was going to return. Just this past week, President Biden said that some of the more radical MAGA supporters of Trump were semi-fascist. He actually used that terminology. First time that he's done that. And of course, many Republicans said, no, this was a smear. This was basically hate speech directed against them. There is a certain modicum of truth in the application of that kind of, let's say, label. But it also is in some ways dangerous. The same with the application of the term Nazi. Both Nazism and fascism have become, in a way, debased rhetorical currency because they've been used so frequently, they've been used so indiscriminately to attack one's political opponents that they become too diffuse, too almost meaningless. Now, having said that, it is disturbingly true that there are parallels in both the goals and the methods of the current authoritarian right in certain circumstances, which is one of the reasons why works like Leo Lowenthal's Prophets of Deceit, which goes through all of the techniques of the demagogues in the 1940s and 50s, is applicable once again today. And it's also why the Racket Society analysis of the Frankfurt School, which tried to explain fascism in the 1940s, also helps to explain someone like Trump, who is really as much a racketeer as he is a politician, as much a kind of criminal thug who demands loyalty, who provides protection, as he is a normal politician. So there is, I think, some cautious warrant, some cautious justification for going so far as to use terms like semi-fascist or even, in certain cases, fascist. Populism is, of course, much more problematic as a term because it has always had a leftist as well as rightist use. So people like my old friend Ernesto Laclau in Argentina use populism in a more positive way to explain the critique of globalization and neoliberalism. And left populism was, under certain circumstances, a positive force which overcame, for example, racial differences. Sometimes. Now, there were, of course, authoritarian populists, and Perón, and we can think of other examples of populism which could be used by demagogic figures to create a kind of critique of both liberalism and democracy in ways that were usable by people who had a different agenda. So populism had, let's say, the potential to be turned in one direction or the other. And because it was often driven more by resentment and anger than it was by a positive program, it's anti-elitism, it's anti-expertise, it's anti-science, it's anti-rationalism sometimes, it could become a, let's say, feeding ground for something even more dangerous, which we now call fascism. So these terms are now part of our vocabulary. Perhaps we need to, generate new terms. And we also, and I think this comes back to a point that Felipe made about the international globalization of right-wing phenomena. We also have to deal with the paradox that the right wing was often nationalist and anti-globalist, and yet it somehow imported techniques from different cultures and created a kind of fascist international or a populist international or an anti-cultural Marxist international in which traveling conspiracy theories crossed boundaries and created what might be seen as the post-nationalist phenomenon. So populism, in a weird way, both moves in the direction of anti-universalism, anti-globalization, anti-internationalism, and yet spills across borders and through a kind of copycat mimetic mechanism can provide a kind of sustenance for an international phenomenon. So Bolsonaro and Trump understood that each was a bedfellow of the other. And there's a clear sense of mutual recognition, mutual admiration, which showed that they understood basically techniques that could be used and common enemies and maybe even a common agenda. So I have no, definitive answer to whether or not these terms are always appropriate, but they are certainly part of our rhetoric, even with the dangers that we face when we simply label people as fascists, when we label people as authoritarian populists, rather than listen to them and take what they have to say, as I said earlier, as a cry of a certain amount of pain. Resentment comes not from nowhere, and we have to understand its sources rather than simply treat its effects.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have just been
Muito
informed
obrigada. Eu acabei de ser informada que, na verdade, a nossa sessão, que eu achei que era de 2 horas, na verdade é só de 1 hora.
few closing words. Gostaria de concluir
I would like
agora,
to say just a few closing words
porque o nosso tempo
because our time
e,
is up.
fazendo os seguintes comentários.
And I would like to say, to make a comment, because
Fechar a cortina depois do show de rock também que vocês fizeram.
I would also like to close the curtains after the rock concert that you gave us.
Essa questão de insistir nessa questão.
So I would like to
Da dificuldade de
insist
conversa.
on how
Essa
difficult
razoável
the conversation is and the reasonable paranoia that we have in front of others. And I would like to also talk about some ghosts I see behind Frankfurt School and Brazilian, and that is the death of populations. I see a certain distress and pain that exists in Brazilian society, and it's badly managed. It has been recognized and it goes away, and that is the pain of slavery. That pain, and I'm not talking about pain as something subjective, but I am talking about the difficulty of positioning, and I am speaking as a white person. How can we have a position? Denial. We're going to deny it. So that came as a denial of responsibility. So speaking about along with the idea of paranoia, I would like to ask, shouldn't we have a little bit of paranoia that can be invested in retelling history, retelling Brazilian history that took us to a situation where change is not believable anymore? And that is why the dynamics that we are talking about, something making sense and then not making sense. I'm very happy to end this here. I'm sorry, I misunderstood it because I thought that our session was 2 hours long, but it is not. So I would like to end it here unless Professor Martin J wants to talk to us a little bit more and end this. It is a right that you have.
I know we have to end. I'd love to talk. I'd love to come to Rio and actually talk in person. So that's the kind of promise that I make.
All right. Yes. Estamos aqui lhe esperando. Muito obrigada.
Okay, yes, we're here waiting for you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Felipe Catalani, Rosane Borges. Thank you, Professor J. And thank you, Leonardo Santos, that made this event happen. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it.